Hello guys, once again welcome to our YouTube channel Edu Hub, and as you know this part 2 of data analysis, so please stay and learn course and don't forget to share to your friends and family members. Guys, I do a hard so I need attention, so please do that share video. So without wasting time, let's get started. Data Analysis Part 2.
Hey, welcome back. It's time to begin our exploration of maybe the single most powerful feature in Excel's arsenal, pivot tables. So what the heck is a pivot table? In short, it's a tool for rapidly summarizing and analyzing data, with no formulas required. Pivot tables especially shine when it comes to quickly gleaning insights from large data sets, those with far more distinct records or data points than we could possibly reason about without some help from Excel's massive computer brain. But there's a kicker. Pivot tables are picky about how your data is structured. If you want to analyze a data set with pivot tables, it must be organized in a tabular fashion. That is to say, with columns containing distinct types of data and column headers describing those columns. This is a small price to pay though, and honestly that's how you should be organizing your data 99% of the time anyway. Now I could keep going on and on about how awesome pivot tables are, but they're really more of a show kind of feature versus a tell kind of feature. So let's go ahead and get some hands-on practice using pivot tables. So here we have our sample call center data set that has a variety of statistics pertaining to calls received at a call center. It also contains a number of categorical or non-numeric fields that describe or categorize each data point in a certain way. For example, in column J, the employee name, which is the name of the employee who took the call, the site where that employee works, the manager of the employee, and the type of call that was taken. Applying a pivot table to this data set will allow us to combine quantitative metrics like call duration in minutes and abandoned calls with categorical fields like employee name and site in ways that will give us quick insights into this very large data set, which ranges almost to 100,000 records. So how do we create the pivot table? Well, there are a couple ways we can go about it, but my preference is first to select the data set that we're going to analyze with our pivot table, and then insert the pivot table once the data is selected. Now note here that it is crucial to include the column headers in the data you're selecting. Every aspect of the process of analyzing data with a pivot table will revolve around the concept of our data being organized into columns. So having column headers and descriptive names in those column headers is key. So with that said, let me go ahead and select our entire data set, which I'll do using Control-Shift right arrow, Control-Shift down arrow. And now to insert the pivot table, I'll go to the Insert tab on the ribbon, and then click the Pivot Table button all the way over on the left. And now you see in this dialog box that Excel recognizes that we've already selected the range of cells that we want to analyze with the pivot table. And you can also see that using an external data source is an option, and that's something we'll look at a little bit later. Now the second choice that Excel presents us with is where we want our pivot table report to be placed, in a new worksheet or the existing worksheet. Most of the time you're going to want to place your pivot table in a brand new worksheet because the data you're analyzing is taking up so much space on the other worksheet, it really wouldn't make sense for you to try to put both in one place. So we'll leave the default of new worksheet and then click OK. And over here on the right, you see what we can think of as the command center for our pivot table. First, there's a list of all the fields in our data, which Excel was able to recognize because we organized our data into columns and named those columns with column headers. And then down below that list of fields, we see 4 empty squares, one for filters, one for columns, one for rows, and one for values. And Excel is telling us that we can drag fields between those areas. So I'm not going to explain what all 4 of these areas are for right away. Instead, I think it's more constructive to just go ahead and drag one of our fields into one of those areas so you can see how it works. So I think I'll grab my site field and I'll drag it into the rows area at the bottom left. And now what we see is that a list of the unique values in our site column, which is to say our 3 sites, has been inserted into our blank worksheet. So by itself, that doesn't seem terribly useful. I mean, couldn't we have gotten a list of distinct values just by using the remove duplicates feature, for example? Well, yes, but this is a crucial first step to data analysis because typically your analysis is going to involve breaking down your data set into different categories and then comparing summary metrics among those categories. And in order to compare categories, we first need a unique list of those categories. If we want to compare our 3 sites, we first have to have just those 3 sites listed side by side. So the key thing to remember is, whenever you drag a field from our data into either the rows area or, and I'm getting ahead of myself here just slightly, the columns area, Excel will automatically display just the unique values from that column, no matter how many records the dataset has. So now is where we can actually begin our analysis. So let's say we want to know how many calls were taken at each of our sites. So what we'll do is drag, say, the call ID field into the values area. And keep in mind that by drag, I mean that I'm hovering over that field in the fields list, clicking and holding my mouse button, and then dragging down to that values area. So now I hope that you're getting the gist of how this works. Excel is attempting to apply a summary calculation of the values in our call ID field, broken out by the unique values in the site field. The only problem here is the calculation Excel applied by default just doesn't make a lot of sense. If we go back to our raw data worksheet, we see that while call ID is a number, it's not really something that makes sense to try to aggregate statistically. Call IDs are just that. They're unique identifiers. They're not meant to be summed or averaged. What we really want to do here is just count the call IDs, so that no more weight is assigned to the 50,000th call ID than to the first. So let's go back to our pivot table, and then click this arrow to the right of call ID in our values area. And then we'll choose Value Field Settings. And right away you can see the problem. Excel guessed that we wanted to sum the values in that field because they were numeric. It just wasn't smart enough to recognize that while those fields were numbers, it really wasn't meaningful to try to add them. So instead we're going to choose Count, and then click OK. And there we have it, a breakout of the number of calls taken by each site. Now I wouldn't blame you for thinking this all looks a little magical and being a little skeptical about the accuracy of these numbers. So let me prove it to you. Let's take note of the number of calls at the Jacksonville, Florida site, 35,562. Now let's go back to our data worksheet and apply filters to our data set. And now I will filter for just our Jacksonville site. And if you look down to our status bar at the bottom left, it says 35,562 records found. So I hope at this point you'll believe that the other 2 numbers are accurate as well. Now if you want to see the detailed data behind any of these numbers in the pivot table, you don't have to go to the trouble of filtering the source data set. Instead, you can use pivot table's drill down feature to get to that detailed data in literally 2 clicks of your mouse. So if I just double click this number here associated with the Jacksonville, Florida site, Excel automatically generates a table with just those records pertaining to that particular group. And if we click the filter button on the site column, you'll see that the only site in this data set that was generated is Jacksonville, Florida. And then if I click in my first row of data and then Control-Shift down arrow to select all the way to the bottom, you'll see in our status bar we have a count of 35,562 records, once again proving that Excel only included records pertaining to that particular site in our generated data set here. So I'll go ahead and delete this sheet that was generated. And now lastly, I'll show that you are not limited to adding just one metric to your pivot table. Let's say we want to break out a couple other summary statistics by site. For example, maybe we want to see a count of abandoned calls by site. So if I scroll down to find call abandoned among our pivot table fields, and then just drag that down to the values section, we'll see that not only does the metric slot in neatly next to our previous one, but this time Excel's guess that we wanted to apply a sum calculation to the values does make sense. If we go back to the call abandoned field in our source data, you can see that every record has a value of 1 or 0, with 1 indicating that a call was abandoned and 0 indicating that it was not. So by simply summing all of the 1s, we effectively get a count of all the abandoned calls for that particular site. Just to reiterate, and again using the Jacksonville, Florida site as an example, Excel is basically saying, first, let's only consider records in our source data set where the site is equal to Jacksonville. And then for our first metric, let's count those records. And then for our second metric, let's sum all the values in that call abandoned field. So if I were to again go back to my data set, and with a filter of Jacksonville, Florida already applied to my site column, if I then apply a filter of 1 to my call abandoned column, Excel tells me that 2,154 records were found. And if I navigate back to my pivot table, that's exactly the number we see for our sum of call abandoned metric. So while we're at it, I'll throw in one more metric, which I think will be call duration in minutes. Now in this case, a simple sum of all the minutes that all the agents at each of our sites spent on the phone isn't that interesting. What I would instead like is an average of how long those calls took. So I again need to change the default calculation that Excel chose for this metric. So let me scroll down to the values section until I see our sum of call duration, and then click our little arrow, and then go to Value Field Settings. And now I'll change the type of calculation applied to this field to average, and then click OK. And now we can see that the employees at our various sites are fairly consistent in terms of how long they take to finish a call. It's roughly 12 minutes per site. So before we go, let's just reiterate the basic structure for our pivot table here. Categorical data, typically non-numeric things like the names of call center sites or employee names, will usually go into the rows or columns area of our pivot table. Then, numeric values to which we can apply statistical calculations typically go in our values section. And then those fields will be summarized statistically by the unique values in whatever columns we dragged into our rows or columns area. And then lastly, I'll point out that there's this weird pseudo column that has appeared in our columns area. So this values pseudo column basically just means that our summarized values are appearing as columns in our pivot table. The count of calls is in the first column, the average of call duration is in the second column, and the sum of abandoned calls is in the third column. Okay, so we've already done a lot with pivot tables, but there is so much more that we can do. We've really just scratched the surface. Up next, we'll look at how we can add even more layers to our pivot table analysis. I'll see you then. Welcome back. Thus far, we've seen how we can use pivot tables to break down summary statistics about our data, number of calls, total abandoned calls, and average call duration by a single dimension, the site where the calls were taken. But what if we wanted to slice and dice our data in more ways than one? Fortunately, pivot tables make this kind of multi-layered analysis intuitive and fast. Let's see how this works by building on our example from the last video. First, by way of briefly recapping Pivot Tables 101, I'll recreate that pivot table from the previous video, but this time from an Excel table instead of a range. So here we have the same data set as in the last video, but it's been converted to an Excel table called call data. So it turns out that this makes the process of creating a pivot table, but also keeping that pivot table source data up to date a lot easier than simply creating a pivot table from a range. So as long as I have any cell within this table selected, if I just go to Insert and then Pivot Table, Excel correctly guesses that I want to use this table, which I've named Call Data, as the source of my pivot. So I don't have to worry about highlighting any cells. Merely having one of those cells inside the table selected is enough. And just like in the last video, I'll choose New Worksheet and then click OK. And now we're back to our familiar pivot table command center. Now before I start dragging and dropping fields to recreate our pivot table, I want to again emphasize the advantage of creating a pivot table from an Excel table versus a range. Not only did it make it easier for me to create this pivot table, but as I add more data to that table, my pivot table will pick up on those changes automatically, versus me having to reselect a larger range every time more data is added. Alright, so to recreate our pivot from the last video, I'll first drag site under my rows area, and then call ID in values, and then I'll convert that calculation to be a count, and then call duration, which I will convert to be an average instead of a sum, and finally calls abandoned, which I will leave as the default sum. But the real point of this video is going to be to add more layers to our analysis. So in the spirit of showing more than telling, which is generally conducive to the learning process when explaining pivot tables, I'm just going to drag another field into our rows area. And that will be employee name. So I'll drag that under our site heading. And now we see that under each site heading, we have a list of all of the employees who work at that site with their individual statistics broken out. And then on the rows where the actual name of the site is listed, the summary statistics for that site overall are listed. Now I'll add another layer to this by dropping in manager name below site but above employee name in our rows area. And now if I scroll up, you'll see that we have yet another layer in our hierarchy. Under our Aurora, Colorado site, we see the next level in the hierarchy down is the names of our managers. And then below each of those managers, we have the names of all of their employees. And at each level of the pivot table, whether it be site, manager, or employee, we see the statistics specific to that particular level to the right of that entity in the rows area. So a couple things I want to clarify before we move on. One is that you can think of each number in the pivot table as a kind of intersection or address of any number of filters that are being applied in the rows area or the columns area of the pivot table. So if I look at this number 89 here in cell C7, that number represents the sum of abandoned calls at the intersection of our Aurora, Colorado site, a manager named Elsie Taplin, and an employee named Aleda Singh. So that metric is being calculated only for rows in our data where all three of those conditions are true. Where our site is Aurora, Colorado, our manager is Elsie Taplin, and our employee is Aleda Singh. Likewise, if we move up to cell C5, this number 643 represents all the abandoned calls where the manager was Elsie Taplin and the site was Aurora, Colorado, but because we're only at the second level of the pivot table hierarchy and not the third, no employee level filters are being applied to that number. And lastly, this 1,981 here just represents all the abandoned calls at the Aurora, Colorado site. Now the other point I want to make is in regards to your decision as to how to order your fields in the rows area of the pivot table fields list. So your general rule should be fields with fewer distinct values, like for example site, should go highest in the hierarchy, and fields with more distinct values should go lowest. Take for example what would happen if I moved employee name to the very top of our list of fields in our rows area. So if I click this arrow next to employee name, and then choose move to beginning, our pivot table still produces accurate numbers, but these hierarchies are no longer meaningful. Instead of a larger site level number being broken out by smaller subtotals, those being for manager and employee, we instead start with the smallest subtotal. So our total for our first employee here listed, and then the subtotal for the site, and then the further subtotal for employee are all the same number. So again, you want to think of this as a hierarchy where the field with the fewest distinct values goes first, and so on. So I'll move employee back to the bottom of the hierarchy by clicking our arrow here and choosing move to end. And now lastly, just to demonstrate that you can have fields in the columns area as well as the rows area in the same pivot table, I'm going to drag our call type description field into the columns area. And now just to make a little bit more room, I'm going to close out of our pivot table fields list here. And while you could correctly argue that this pivot table is getting a little busy, it's still providing us a pretty powerful and condensed summary of a reasonably large amount of data that we have on our data worksheet. So moving horizontally across the top of the pivot, we see that we have 3 primary columns, one for each call type description, billing, sales, and tech support. And then under each of those primary columns, we have 3 secondary columns for each of our metrics. So basically these metrics are subheadings under each of the primary headings that are our call type descriptions. And just to extend the analogy that we used earlier about each of these numbers representing a kind of intersection or address among all the different fields that have been dragged into the row area or column area, if we look at this number 28 here in cell C12, this represents the number of abandoned calls that had a call type description of billing that were taken at the Aurora, Colorado site, that were taken by an employee whose manager was Elsie Taplin, and that were taken by the employee whose name was Sheila Garcia. Now just to confirm that, let me go back to my data worksheet, and I'll first filter for site equals Aurora, Colorado, and then I'll look at my manager name field and look for our manager, so we're filtering for Elsie Taplin, and then I'll look for our employee in the employee name field, and that was Sheila Garcia, and lastly I'll filter for call type description equals billing, and then I'll filter for call abandoned equals 1, which should give us our count of abandoned calls. And we'll see if we apply all those filters that 28 records were returned, which is of course the number reflected in our pivot table for the intersection of all those distinct values. Now before we move on, I want to demonstrate a technique you can apply to condense the output of pivot tables as they can grow somewhat more elaborate like the one we see here. So looking at our row headings, you'll see that there are these little minus signs next to the top 2 levels among our fields in our rows area. So if I click this minus sign next to Elsie Taplin, suddenly all the detail data underneath her disappears. And then if I click the plus sign next to her, it reappears. Now you can also do this at the site level, so I can click this minus sign next to Aurora, Colorado, and then all the data under that collapses. And then I can again get it back just by clicking the plus sign. Obviously this isn't applicable to the headings at the lowest level of the hierarchy, that being employee. Now if you want to collapse a certain level of the hierarchy for the entire pivot table and not just a single section, you can actually right-click any entity at that level of the hierarchy and then hover over Expand and Collapse and then choose Collapse Entire Field. And now for our entire pivot table, the detail has been collapsed to the level of site and manager with individual employees no longer being visible. But then if I right-click any of these managers and then hover over Expand and Collapse and then choose Expand Entire Field, now all of our employees are visible yet again. Now before we move on, let's swap out the row labels on our pivot table with something perhaps a little more interesting, a date. But first we need to get our pivot table field list back. So how do we do that? Well, you might have noticed at the top right corner of our ribbon that we have this new contextual ribbon tab, just like we see when we click inside of an Excel table. And that of course is because we have clicked inside of this pivot table. So if we click this Pivot Table Analyze tab, we'll see that we have a whole set of controls specific to pivot tables. Now the one we need to show our field list again is this Field List button at the very top right. If we click that, our field list reappears. So our goal here is to remove Site, Manager, and Employee from our rows area and replace that with our Call Timestamp field, which lists the date and time on which a call was placed. So to remove fields from the pivot table, you don't even have to click in the rows area or the columns area. Instead, you can simply uncheck them from the fields list here. So I can scroll down and uncheck employee name, uncheck site, and uncheck manager name. Now this is a fairly uninteresting pivot at this point, but all we have to do to fix that is just drag in call timestamp to our rows area. And right away we see something interesting. Even though our call timestamp field simply had date time values, Excel has automatically grouped these values by month. And then if we click this now familiar plus sign under May, we'll see that our May calls have been broken out by individual date. So Excel clearly has some built-in intelligence around how to handle date and time values in a pivot table. But we don't have to depend on Excel's artificial intelligence to decide how to group date values. So let's say I decided I didn't want months to be included in my pivot. I certainly didn't explicitly ask for that, Excel just assumed that I wanted it. How would I remove that? Before I make that tweak, I'm actually going to change the layout of our pivot table field list over here to make it a little easier to work with when we're focusing on the rows, columns, and values areas. So I'll click the arrow next to this little gear icon, and then choose Areas Section Only 2x2. And now I have a much clearer view of the fields in the different areas of my pivot. So you'll see that Excel has automatically added this months pseudo field above my call timestamp field in the rows area. But I can click the arrow next to that and choose Remove Field. And now my data is broken out just by date. But what if I wanted to add some other sort of date grouping? Maybe I wanted my data to be broken out by year, month, and date. To do that, I would simply right-click any of the date values in my row labels, and then choose Group. And you'll see that by default, Excel assumes, and this is the assumption we saw it make earlier, that we want to group by days and months. But clearly we have a lot of other options here. We can also group by years if we want, quarters, or even hours, minutes, and seconds. So I'm actually going to uncheck years, but then select hours. So now we should see our data broken out by month, day, and even hour of the day. So now I'll click OK. And now instead of just seeing patterns in how our calls arrive on days of the month, we also can see hourly level trends, which is a whole new level of analysis. So lastly, before we go, I'll just change my pivot table field list layout to its default. So I'll click again this gear icon and then choose Field Section and Areas Section Stacked. Now speaking of layout and appearances, we haven't been paying much attention to the aesthetic appeal of our pivot table. Up to this point, we've focused strictly on number crunching. But up next, we'll explore some of the ways that you can customize the format, look, and feel of your pivot tables. I'll see you then. Hey, welcome back. So up to this point, we've learned to leverage pivot tables as a very powerful tool to analyze large amounts of data quickly. But providing truly effective data analysis is more than just about crunching numbers. It's also about presenting your data in a way that is easily understandable and attractively formatted to a broad audience. So in this one, we're going to clean up our example pivot table here to make it something we wouldn't be ashamed to present to the CEO. So my first step here is actually going to be to remove call type description from my columns area. While that is a useful breakout to have, as you'll see later, it's perfectly possible to have more than one pivot table pointing to the same data set. And when you find that you've dragged so many fields into your pivot table that it's hard to reason about what each number in an individual cell means, it's probably time to start removing fields. So I'll go to my field list and then remove my call type description field. And now I think I'll actually replace my dates in my row area with our original hierarchy of site, manager, and employee. So I'll remove my months field, my days field, and my call timestamp field. And then I'll add back in my site field, my manager name field, and finally my employee name field. So now, instead of a pivot table that's kind of trying to be all things to all audiences, we have a clean, focused breakout of 3 primary statistics by an employee hierarchy that goes from manager all the way to site. So the first step in our visual cleanup here will be to properly name and format our metrics in columns B through D. For example, this column name count of call ID isn't exactly descriptive and doesn't really tell an end user of our pivot table what the numbers in that column really mean. And furthermore, considering the numbers in this column typically are so large, it would be nice to format them with a comma in the thousands place. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first I'll tweak the layout of my pivot table field list to only show the areas section 2 by 2. So now we've got a cleaner view of all the fields we've dragged into our pivot. And then I'll click the arrow to the right of my count of call ID metric, and then choose Value Field Settings. Now here, in the Custom Name dialog box, I have the option to type in, as you might guess, a custom name for this field. So I think I'll call it Calls Received. Now as to adding the comma in the thousands place of the numbers, all I have to do is click this Number Format button in the bottom left corner of the dialog box, and then I can format those numbers the way I would format any other number in an Excel spreadsheet. This Format Cells dialog box should look pretty familiar to you. So I'll go to Number, and then because our number in this column is a count, I won't need any decimal places, so I'll place a 0 there, and then I'll put a check mark next to Use Thousands Separator, and then click OK, and then OK once again. And now we have a meaningful name for our column that contains data about the number of calls our sites received. And these numbers have been formatted with a comma in the thousands place. So now let's take some similar steps to clean up our Sum of Call Abandoned field. So again, I'll click that field in my pivot table field list, choose Value Field Settings, and then I'll assign a custom name of Calls Abandoned. And again, I'll format this number to have a comma in the thousands place with no decimal places. And then lastly, for my average of call duration field, I'll format that to have 1 decimal place, since this is a number that potentially could be fractional. So again, clicking that in the fields list, I'll change the name to average call duration, and then format the number to have 1 digit after the decimal place. And I think you can agree we're looking way better already. But there's a lot more to formatting pivot tables than just formatting the numbers in our metrics. So if we click this Design Contextual tab in the ribbon, on the right we'll see a number of built-in pivot table styles, very similar to the styles that we were able to apply to Excel tables. So if I click the down arrow to the right of these, I can hover over any of these for a preview of how our pivot table would look with that given style applied. Now my personal preference has always been the light blue pivot style medium, so I'll go ahead and click that one. Obviously, your taste or the taste of your audience may differ, but that's why Excel has so many built-in formatting options available. Now another visual feature of our pivot table to consider is its layout. So over on the left side of this Design tab, we'll see a button called Report Layout. Now if I click that, I'll see that we actually have a few different layout options. There's Compact Form, Outline Form, and Tabular Form. Now the current and default layout, which is the one I would recommend for most cases, is Compact Form. So if we select that, nothing changes. But if we change our layout to Outline Form, you'll see that now each of our fields that we dragged into the rows area of our pivot table field list, basically our row groupings, gets its own column. So Site is now in column A, Manager Name is now in column B, and Employee Name is in column C. This can be a helpful layout if you really want to emphasize the levels of hierarchy in your pivot table and how the different fields in the rows area relate to each other. Then the tabular form is really very similar to the outline form. It just gives you a little less breathing room visually. This is one that I personally wouldn't recommend, since the outline form is so similar, but provides a little more breathing room visually. But again, in the vast majority of cases, the default compact layout is perfectly sufficient, so we'll go ahead and revert to that. Another important visual aspect to pivot tables is subtotals. These are the aggregations of our metrics that we see at each level of the hierarchy in our pivot. For example, we see manager level roll-ups of our 3 metrics for each manager in our pivot table in the row in which that manager appears. This 10,872 number to the right of Elsie Taplin represents the total number of calls received by Elsie's employees. Likewise, we also have subtotals at the highest level of hierarchy in our pivot, which is site. Hence why we also see these even larger numbers in the same row as our Aurora, Colorado row header. Now these subtotals will appear in your pivot table by default, and most of the time you'll want to keep them. They're very useful, and typically people want to see how these metrics break down at each level of hierarchy in your pivot table. However, you do have the option to manipulate whether or not they appear and where they appear. So if we click this Subtotals button on the left side of the Design tab, we'll see that we can opt to not show subtotals, in which case all of those roll-ups at each level of the hierarchy disappear. In this case, after choosing this option, we only see our metrics for the lowest level in our hierarchy, which is employee. Again, most of the time not what you're going to want, but it's worth noting that that is an option you have in case, for whatever reason, your audience finds the subtotals to introduce too much clutter into your pivot tables. But for our purposes, I'm going to add our subtotals back, and I'll make sure to do it at the top of the group, because while you do have the option to add them to the bottom of the group, it's just not as aesthetically pleasing and will be confusing to most users of a pivot table. So not only does our pivot table have subtotals by default that break down our metrics for each level of hierarchy in the pivot table, it also has grand totals that display all-in numbers for our metrics calculated across all the rows in our source data. So to see these, first I'll collapse our site level groupings by right-clicking our Aurora, Colorado site, and then hovering over Expand and Collapse, and then clicking Collapse Entire Field. And now if you look at the bottom of our newly condensed pivot table, you see that there is a grand total row that adds up our three metrics for all the rows in our source data set. Again, like with our subtotals, you'll want to keep grand totals in your pivot tables most of the time. Most users would be interested in comparing the numbers at each level of our hierarchy with the all-in number at the very bottom. However, just like with subtotals, Excel does give us the option to switch these grand totals on and off for all the positions they can occupy in the pivot. So if we hit this Grand Totals button on our Design tab, you'll see that we can turn grand totals off for rows and columns, on for rows and columns, on for rows only, and on for columns only. Now because our metrics are oriented by columns, it really only makes sense for our grand totals to be on for columns. But because our metrics are oriented that way, it really doesn't matter if we choose on for columns only or on for rows and columns. So if I remove our grand totals by choosing off for rows and columns, and then go back to my grand totals button and choose on for columns only, we see our pivot table looks just like it did before. And then if I turn our grand totals off again, and then choose on for rows and columns, it's the same layout as before, because again, our metrics are oriented by columns and not by rows. Alright, so we've got our pivot table looking sharp, but there's still a lot more to learn about pivot tables. Up next, we'll look at how you can add filtering to pivot tables to give you even more dimensions by which to slice and dice your data. I'll see you then. Welcome back. Up to this point, our pivot tables have been static, which is another way of saying that other than expanding or collapsing groupings, there hasn't been any real mechanism for an end user to slice, dice, and otherwise interact with the output. But we're about to change that by adding filters to our pivot table. Filters on pivot tables work in much the same way as filters applied to ranges or Excel tables. They allow us to narrow the scope of the data we see in the pivot to zoom in on some subset of the data that we're interested in. Filtering can be applied at the report level or to individual fields within our pivot. Report level filters are what will really empower our end users to create custom cuts of the data, but we'll start with filters applied to individual fields to get us warmed up. So here in our example pivot table, let's say I wanted to filter our output to only show data pertaining to our Jacksonville, Florida site. So to do that, I need to click any row header that's at the same level of hierarchy as the Jacksonville, Florida site, which of course is the site level. So for example, I can just click my Aurora, Colorado row header here, and now I'll be able to apply filtering to that level of the hierarchy. So having selected that cell, I'll then click this filter button in the top left cell of the pivot, and now we have a filtering dialog box that's pretty much the same as the ones we've seen for Excel tables and just applying filters to ranges. So now I'll uncheck Select All, and then check Jacksonville, Florida, and click OK. And now the scope of our pivot has been narrowed to just data pertaining to our Jacksonville, Florida site. So what happens if I want to apply filtering to a different level of our hierarchy? For example, maybe I want to filter my output to focus on a handful of managers versus seeing all of them, but I'm not interested in applying a site level filter. Well, first I'll clear our existing filter, and then to apply a filter to the manager level of our hierarchy, I'll just click any of the row headers that contain a manager. So for example, I'll click the cell that contains the row header for Nova Harshberger. And now if I go back up to my filter button, you'll see that instead of our sites being listed, all of our managers are listed because the cell I had selected before clicking the filter button was at the manager level of the hierarchy. So now I can just randomly select a few managers to appear in the output and click OK. And now you'll see that my output has been narrowed to just those managers. Now this is one scenario where the outline layout of a pivot table can be a little bit more intuitive than this compact layout. So if I remove my filters here, and then go to Design, Report Layout, and then change my layout to be outline form, now we can apply filters to each of the fields in our rows area a little bit more intuitively. Instead of there being one filter button whose context changes depending on which level of the hierarchy you've selected in the first column, instead I have 3 filter buttons, one for each field in our rows area. So this is in fact one advantage of the outline view versus the compact view. Now this sort of filtering is fine, but it has a couple of limitations. One is that it's not terribly intuitive for a non-technical user of Excel to apply. And one of the great advantages of pivot tables is that they can be deployed as a kind of end-user tool that allows somebody without a lot of technical acumen to still quickly gain insights into their data. So to place a burden on those end users of understanding all the nuances of how to apply filters at different levels of groupings in our pivot table just doesn't make a ton of sense. And there's another problem. What if we want to filter our pivot table by a field that doesn't actually exist in the pivot table? Clearly we need another solution. So first I'm going to revert our layout back to the standard compact layout. And now let's look at a pivot table feature that allows us to filter the pivot table by fields that we haven't even included in the pivot table. These kinds of filters are called report level filters. So let's say, for example, we wanted to be able to filter this pivot table by call type. But we don't want to further clutter our pivot table layout by adding the call type field to our columns area or our rows area. The solution then is to add it as a report level filter. So to do that, I'll click anywhere inside my pivot, then go to our Pivot Table Analyze tab, and then hit my Field List button to make the field list appear. And now I'll search my field list for call type description, and then drag that down into the Filters area of the Pivot Table field list. And now you can see, above and to the left of my pivot table, there's a filter button corresponding to my call type description field. And then if I click that button, we have all the distinct values in that field. And if I choose any one of these, now all of my numbers are adjusted accordingly. So this grand total for my Aurora, Colorado site reflects the totals just for all tech support calls taken at that site versus all calls. And we're not limited to applying filters for a single value. If I click my filter button again, and then check this box next to Select Multiple Items, now I can select any combination of the values available to me in that filter. So if I want to see all billing and sales calls but no tech support, I can just check those and click OK. And now my numbers will adjust accordingly. And just to prove to ourselves that this is working the way we hope, I'll go back to my raw data worksheet and then filter for site equals Aurora, Colorado. And then I'll filter for call type description is billing or sales. And you'll see in the status bar that 16,854 records were returned. And then if I go back to my pivot table, that's exactly the number we have reflected for Aurora, Colorado with those filters applied. Now keep in mind the advantage in terms of the layout of our pivot table to adding call type description as a filter versus including it in the actual physical pivot table layout. So if I clear the filter on call type description and then drag it from the filters area over to the columns area, we can still get to the same information, but as we saw in this layout previously, it's just kind of confusing. It's kind of busy. Now an end user of the pivot table is going to struggle to interpret what any given number here actually means in terms of all the different layers of filtering that are being applied. So if you find that you've dragged so many fields into the rows and columns area of your pivot that it's kind of hard to reason about the numbers, it might be time to pull one or more of those fields out of your main pivot table layout and convert them to filters instead. So I'll make my field list reappear and then go ahead and move call type description back to my filters area. And now to further demonstrate the trade-off between filters versus row and column groups, I'll move our site field here, which is currently the highest level in our rows hierarchy, to the filters area. So first I'll find it in my field list and then just drag it up under call type description in my filters. So the obvious advantage is that my primary pivot table layout is already a good bit cleaner and easier to reason about. Now the disadvantage is I don't get to see the numbers for each of my 3 sites side by side. Instead, I essentially have to page through those numbers one at a time by selecting those individual sites in my filter. But again, keep in mind that this trade-off can be more than worthwhile, especially if you want to add a large number of fields to your pivot table to slice and dice your data in different ways. While Excel will technically allow you to add as many fields to the rows and columns areas as you want, in practicality, excessively complicated layouts quickly become very difficult to interpret and reason about. But with filters, you can really add as many as you like without unduly cluttering your pivot table output. Now, one note about the types of fields that are most appropriate to use as filters. Filters work best on fields that have relatively few distinct values. So for example, our call type field, which has 3 distinct values, and our site field, which also has 3 distinct values, are good candidates to use as report level filters. But something like the date on which a call was made is probably not a good use case for a filter because there's so many possible distinct values. So instead of us seeing a list of 3 items when we click this filter button, we'd see a list of maybe hundreds or maybe even thousands of different distinct items. A field like that with so many distinct values makes more sense in the rows area of the pivot table versus as a filter. Alright, so we've already seen how filters can make our pivot tables more dynamic and user-friendly, while also keeping our layouts relatively uncluttered. But there's actually an even more powerful feature for filtering pivot tables, and that's slicers. We'll talk all about them in the next video. I'll see you then. Hey, welcome back. So we've seen how report level filters can make pivot tables more dynamic data analysis tools for our end users, while also giving us the flexibility to add more dimensions to our pivot than we could feasibly fit into the rows and columns areas. However, Excel gives us an even more powerful and flexible filtering tool called slicers, which can help turn your pivot tables into a dynamic reporting system. Let's see how. So my first step here is going to be to add slicers to our example pivot table on the same fields that we currently have added as report level filters. So I've already clicked inside my pivot table, so I have my Pivot Table Analyze contextual tab on the ribbon. And on this tab, I'm going to want to click the Insert Slicer button. So if I click that, now we see a list of all the fields available to us from our source dataset. So I want to add slicers for the same 2 fields that we currently have report level filters for. So that will be call type description, and site. And now I'll click OK. And we see that instead of a couple of conventional looking filter buttons, we actually get these little boxes that just popped up in the middle of our worksheet. And as you might suspect, we can actually click and drag these boxes to reposition them wherever we want. So right off the bat, we have more visual flexibility than we did with report level filters, which are always in the same position relative to the overall pivot table. So now I'll just reposition our slicers a little more logically above and to the right of our pivot. Now actually using slicers is pretty daggone intuitive. You'll note that we already had our report level filter for site set to Jacksonville, Florida. And you see on our site slicer that Jacksonville, Florida is highlighted and our other two sites are not. This reflects that a filter is currently being set on Jacksonville, Florida. But if I click another site value in the slicer, and now not only does our data change, and not only is Aurora, Colorado now highlighted in our slicer, but we can see that the value in our report level filter changed to align with our slicer. So our slicers essentially can control what we see in those report level filters. Which begs the question, why would we need slicers and report level filters? And the answer is, you really just don't. So I'll actually go ahead and remove our report level filters by going to my field list and then just removing both of my report level filters. Because now our slicers give us all that functionality in a much more attractive, visually intuitive package. Now, just like with any other filter, you can filter for one item at a time, like we've already seen, or you can filter for multiple items at once. So if we click this little icon with multiple check marks above the items in our slicer, this will enable the multi-select mode of the slicer, which means instead of just being able to select one item at a time, we'll be able to select multiple. So now if I click Jacksonville, Florida, that will unselect it, while the other two items remain selected. And similarly, on my call type description slicer, I can click any number of items to unselect them and then simply click them again to select them. So I have the same filtering flexibility I had before, but a much more intuitive visual interface to communicate to the user of the pivot table exactly what filters are being applied and are not. Recall that with a report level filter, if multiple items are selected, you can't actually see which ones are selected unless you click the filter. So if I actually add one of our fields back as a report filter, let's say call type description, and now if I select multiple items in that field, you'll see that our report level filter just says multiple items, but my call type description slicer clearly highlights the two items that have been selected. Now, aside from making our filter selections more obvious and intuitive, slicers also give us a lot of flexibility in terms of how to style them. For example, we can resize them. So if I select a slicer, I can hover my cursor over any of these dots around the perimeter of the slicer and then just drag in any direction to resize the slicer however I want. So I'll actually do that to both of them. I can also change the caption that appears above each slicer. For example, this call type description caption seems a little too technical and not quite user-friendly enough for a pivot table that might be used by somebody who's not particularly technical. So to change that, after selecting the slicer, I'll simply click this contextual menu that pops up on the ribbon only when you select a slicer. We see that at the very top right of the ribbon. So if I click that contextual ribbon tab, over on the left side of that tab, you'll see a box for slicer caption. So I'll change call type description to just call type. And that already looks a lot better. Also on the slicer tab of the ribbon, we have a number of built-in pre-configured styles that Excel provides us for slicers. So if I click this down arrow to the right of those styles, I could choose any one of them to apply to our slicer. This works just the same as with the built-in styles for Excel tables or pivot tables. But for now, I'll revert back to the default light style. And lastly, to clear whatever filters we've applied via our slicers, we can simply click the funnel with the little red X on it at the top right of each slicer. Now, aside from simply being more visually intuitive and attractive, slicers have another really important advantage versus report filters in a pivot table. So we've already discussed that in reality, you're really limited to a certain number of row or column groups in your pivots due to concerns about readability. The solution is often to create multiple pivot tables that present different views of your data. One problem with this solution is that if you have filters on each of your pivot tables, setting that filter to a certain value on one pivot table won't affect the data in the other. And this can lead to your two views of your data being out of sync, which is obviously a bad experience for an end user. But slicers allow you to solve that problem by using one slicer to control multiple pivot tables. So let's see how. So let's say, for example, we want to create a second view of our data in which we group the data on our row labels by date instead of by employee hierarchy. So instead of rebuilding this pivot table from scratch, I'm actually just going to copy and paste it, which is a great way to save time when you're building variations of the same pivot table. The important thing to remember when copying and pasting a pivot table is that you need to copy all the cells that are part of that pivot table. If you miss part of the pivot table, you'll just copy the values from the pivot, but not the pivot itself. So once again, I'll go ahead and remove my report level filter. And then, starting with the top left cell in my pivot, I'll scroll down until I've selected the entire pivot, and then hit Control-C to copy. And then a couple columns over, I'll hit Control-V to paste. And then just to get our pivots aligned and below our slicers, I'll again copy the very first pivot, and now hit Control-X to cut, and then select cell A10 and Control-V to paste. So now we essentially have two identical pivot tables. But what we're going to do is change the row groupings in one to be dates instead of employee hierarchies. So I'll actually do that in our first pivot table. So back to my field list, I'll remove manager name and employee name, and then I'll add our call timestamp. And for this demonstration, I'll stick with Excel's default recommendation of grouping our data by month and then by day. But to get a clearer view of the detailed data, I'll right-click one of my month groupings, hover over Expand and Collapse, and then choose Expand Entire Field. So now I'll see my individual day breakouts under my month breakouts. So just a little more cleanup before we put our slicers to work. I actually don't think I need two columns between our pivots, so I'll delete one of those columns. And now I'll drag our slicers to be somewhat central above our two pivots. So now we're ready to see the power of controlling multiple pivot tables with different views of our data with a single slicer. So if, for example, I select a call type of billing, you'll see the numbers in both of our pivot tables decrease accordingly. So now I have two completely distinct views of our data, both of which can be controlled with multiple levels of filtering by one set of slicers. Now keep in mind that we were able to connect these slicers to both pivot tables without any additional steps because the second pivot table was copied from the first. Now if we had created a brand new pivot table from the same data set but not copied it from the original, we'd have had to take one extra step to connect our slicers to that second pivot table. So if I select one of our slicers, and then again select that slicer tab on the ribbon, and then hit the Report Connections button, you'll see a list of the pivot tables our slicers are connected to. In this case, just the two pivot tables we have here. But if I had created a third pivot table from our data set from scratch, not by copying and pasting one of the existing pivot tables, that pivot table would appear in this list, but unchecked. But all we'd have to do is just check the box next to it, and then we could control that pivot with these slicers as well. So I hope you can see what a powerful feature this is. Using slicers to control multiple pivot tables that provide different views of your data are the key to creating dashboards with a number of at-a-glance views that can be controlled by a single filter. Okay, so our pivot tables have grown fairly sophisticated. But one thing that's remained fairly simple is the actual calculations we're doing in our pivot tables. To this point, pretty much simple counts, sums, and averages. Up next, we'll look at some techniques for adding more sophisticated calculations to our pivot tables. I'll see you then. Hey, welcome back. So while we've been able to assemble some pretty nifty breakouts of our call center data using pivot tables, our actual calculations themselves have been pretty basic. Just counts, sums, and averages of numeric fields in our data. And to be sure, pivot tables aren't quite as flexible when it comes to crunching out complicated calculations as formulas and functions. However, there are a few tricks we can use to add some more nuanced metrics to our pivot table views. One such metric we might want to add is service level percentage, which is the percent of customer calls that were answered within an acceptable time frame, say 30 seconds. So if we look at the detailed data on our data worksheet, we'll see that we have a column called wait time, which tells us how long a customer had to wait before their call was answered. But how the heck can we translate this into a percentage of calls answered in 30 seconds that would appear in our pivot table? Well, one common approach in scenarios like this is to add a helper column or helper field to our detailed data that we can then use in our pivot to calculate the metric. So first I'm going to insert a new column to our table to the right of wait time. And I'm going to call this column service level met. And now in the column, I'm going to write an if statement that looks at our value in the wait time field. And if that wait time is 30 seconds or less, we'll return a 1, indicating that service level was met. And if not, we'll return a 0, indicating that it wasn't. So let's go ahead and type that out. Okay, so this is a step in the right direction, but how can we use this field in our pivot table to produce the percentage that we're looking for? Well, first let's try to drag it into our pivot table. So back to the worksheet that has our pivot table, I'll go to our field list, and then I'll look for our new field. But that's weird, I actually don't see our new field. Now why is that? So our new field is not appearing in our pivot table field list because our pivot table isn't actually directly tied to our source data in real time. Instead, when we created the pivot table, the source data was loaded into something called the pivot cache. This pivot cache is basically a copy of the data that the pivot table points to. Now what this means is that if we make changes to our pivot table's source data, the pivot doesn't update automatically, unlike with formulas and functions. So to see our new field, here under our Pivot Table Analyze tab, I'm going to want to click the down arrow under this refresh button, and then choose Refresh. And now if we scroll up our field list, we see our service level met field. So now I'll drag that into our values area. And then just to clean up our pivot table a little bit, I think I'll go ahead and remove these other metrics. So already this is providing us with some level of useful insight, which is basically a sum of all the calls that were answered at each site and by each manager and each employee respectively within that service level threshold we defined. But what we're looking for is a percentage. So how can we turn those ones and zeros into an actual percentage that will be reflected in our pivot? Well, it turns out it's actually really easy. All we actually have to do is summarize those ones and zeros as an average instead of a sum, and then format the result as a percentage. So if I do all that and click OK, and then once more, now we have the percentage of calls that were taken within 30 seconds at each level of hierarchy in our pivot table. Now it might not be completely intuitive as to how this works, so I'll take a second to explain the math behind it. Let's say you have 10 calls and 9 of them were taken within 30 seconds and 1 was not. That means 9 of those calls would have gotten a 1 in our new service level met field and 1 did not. So what happens when you take the average of 9 ones and 1 0? Well, if you add the 9 ones up, you get the number 9. Now to get your average, you take the sum of those numbers and divide by the total count of the numbers, which is 10. So 9 divided by 10 is 0.9. Then if you format that as a percent, you get 90%. And that's exactly how our percentages here are being calculated. If 88.18% of a certain subset of records had ones instead of zeros, that's the percentage we see in the pivot table. Generally speaking, whenever you have some kind of binary performance metric like this one, where some threshold of performance was either met or it wasn't, and you want to calculate the percentage of times it was or wasn't met in your pivot table, then this approach is an extremely effective one. And then just for some final cleanup, I'll go ahead and rename our new metric. And there we go. Now there is another feature called calculated fields, which allow us to bake these derived fields directly into our pivot table. But to be honest with you, they don't offer nearly the same flexibility for doing calculations as derived fields in our source data, and they're also a little bit clunky to work with. If you want to add derived calculations directly into your pivot tables, there's a much better way to do it than calculated fields, but that involves a relatively new feature in Excel called Power Pivot and a whole new formula language called DAX. Now that's a whole other topic in and of itself. That's a lot more than we can go into here. It's honestly a topic worthy of its own course. So for now, I'd recommend the approach of adding calculated fields to your detailed data and then summarizing them creatively in your pivot table. Now, one other way to put a different spin on the counts and totals in your pivot tables are to summarize them as percentages rather than straight numbers. So let me show you what I mean. If we drag our call ID field back into our pivot and then summarize it as a count, and then I'll just name it calls answered. Now we have a breakout of the number of calls answered at every level of hierarchy in our pivot. But what if I wanted to show these values as a percent of a whole? Well, Excel actually makes this really easy. So if I right-click any value in that column and then hover over Show Values As, one popular option we can choose is percent of column total. Now that makes sense in this particular situation because we have our metrics oriented in columns and not rows. If our metrics were oriented towards rows and our categorical fields like site and manager were oriented by columns, we'd instead choose percent of row total. But if I click this percent of column total, now the number next to each individual row label reflects that particular item's contribution to the overall total. So for example, Aurora, Colorado took 34.34% of all calls taken at all three of our sites. Jacksonville, Florida took 35.93%, Spokane, Washington took 29.73%, and then if we go all the way down to our grand total, it adds up to 100%. And we see similar breakouts for individual managers. So Jamar Prall's team here took 11% of our overall call volume. And then that breakdown continues to the level of the individual employee. Now another approach we can take, if we right-click any number in this column again and hover over Show Values As, is to display our numbers not as a percent of the overall total, but as a percent of the total of the parent group. So if I choose percent of parent row total, now we see some more meaningful numbers at the lower levels of hierarchy in our pivot. For example, instead of seeing tiny percentages next to each individual employee, which while accurate, don't give us a picture of how these employees are doing relative to their peers, we now instead see the number of calls each employee took as a percentage of the calls taken by their team. So if I highlight all these percentages under Elsie Taplin and then look down at the status bar, you'll see they add up to 100%. That's because under this mode of summarization, individual numbers are shown as a percentage of the total in the parent group. Likewise, if we added the percentages of Elsie Taplin, Nova Harshberger, Rana Taub, and Shayla Lyon, they would add up to 100%. That 100% being the number of calls taken at the Aurora, Colorado site. Either of these approaches can be valid depending on your particular use case. Okay, now that you have a strong foundation in pivot tables, in the next section we'll build on that foundation by exploring how we can summarize multiple data sets in a single pivot table using a revolutionary new feature called the Excel Data Model. I'll see you then.